The first setting that we're going to talk about is animation durations. This is setting how long the animation will take. So if you want the animation to take 2 seconds, you can set it to be 2 seconds. Now, like I mentioned in the introduction video, you have to do this inside of CSS. You don't really do this inside of HTML. So we need to be familiar a little bit with CSS. And so we're going to create a class in CSS. We're also going to add on some vendor prefixes. We'll talk about what vendor prefixes are, and then we're going to adjust the duration from there. So I have my sample project here, and I'm going to go ahead and pull that sample project up in Sublime, double click on the index.html file, and you can see we still have our same settings from our last project. So if you're continuing on, you can just use those files there. You don't have to download the starter files for this section at all. You can just continue using that. But what we need to do is we need to come into the CSS file. So I'm going to select this drop down box. If you have the folders open, you can do that. Otherwise, you're going to have to get to where it says interaction.css. Now this is my own CSS, the CSS that I used to create the layouts for that section. And you can see that it has responsive code that I can go in and adjust some of that responsive code. But what I want to do is come down a couple sections right before that responsive code, and I want to add on a class for section 1. I'm going to talk to section 1, and so the way that I talk to a class is by adding on a dot inside of CSS. I'm going to come down one more line, and I'm going to add a comment by hitting Command backslash or Control backslash if you're on a PC. And I'm going to go ahead and say custom code, and in section 1 where you put the properties and the values is inside of curly brackets. So I'm going to make sure that I have a starting curly bracket and a closed curly bracket. From here, what I start to do is I start to add on what's called vendor prefixes. Now vendor prefixes are essentially ways to communicate with certain different types of browsers. If you think about all the different types of browsers that there are, you have Safari, you have Chrome, you have Firefox, you have Internet Explorer, you have Edge. There's a lot of different browsers out there. Now each company that makes a browser can adjust that browser and how it reads the HTML file and the CSS file differently. So in this case, if you want it to read in a certain way, then you have to have in animation or duration, you have to have what's called a vendor prefix for the type of browser that it is. It's because some browsers will adapt something called a WebKit, which means that it's more of a general kit that can be used, and then other browsers don't use that kit, so you're going to have to use a different kit. It's just a couple things. If you want to read into it, I would look up vendor prefixes, and you can dive in and explore it a little bit more. But the way that you do this is you basically type in, and this is where you'll type in the vendor, whatever type of vendor it is, whether it be WebKits or something else, and then you type in dash animation. Usual CSS is basically applying the property and then the value of that property. So right now we're just typing in the property, and there is a couple dashes to get this, and then one more dash is duration. So we're going to say vendor, whatever the vendor is, animation duration, and then we have a colon and then a semicolon to end that line. So what I want to do is add on how many seconds I want this to take. If I want this to be 5 seconds, then I have to type in 5s. Now S standing for seconds. If you want it to be 5.5, you could do that as well. But the key is I can't just have vendor here. I need to specifically talk to a certain type of vendor. Now, if you're just targeting like Safari or Chrome, kind of the more modern browsers, then all you have to do is actually add on WebKits. If you're going to target other ones, then you have to come in and you have to find the different vendor prefixes for those other browsers. Here is one vendor prefix that I'm familiar with, which is developer.mozilla.org, and then you can see the rest of the URL there. I'm going to go ahead and go to that URL, and you can see right here where it says vendor prefix, it'll give you an explanation of the different types of vendors that are out there, and you can see that the first one is WebKit, which will basically take care of Chrome, Safari, Opera, iOS browsers, Firefox on iOS, and so forth. Now, MOZ stands for Moz or Mozilla, and so Firefox. O stands for, right here it says versions of Opera or pre-WebKits. MS stands for Internet Explorer, and then Microsoft Edge as well. So if we come back into the code, what I would do is if I want to have other things besides WebKit, then I'd go ahead and paste that and then just type in MOZ, which stands for, or which will apply to Firefox, stands for Mozilla. then I'm basically going to say that this is going to be the duration for that browser. And you have to have both lines if you're going to target all these different types of browsers. But I'm just going to go ahead and preview this for now. I just wanted to make sure that I covered vendor prefixes a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the folder, and I haven't previewed this yet. I'm going to click on index.html, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to preview this, but you'll notice that the animation still happens pretty quickly. The duration did not actually take effect. Now, why is that? Because I haven't actually applied the section 1 class to any object. So what I need to do is I need to come into the animation or come into the HTML, and I'm going to copy, first of all, this is the CSS, but I'm going to copy the section 1, and I'm going to go into index.html, and I'm going to paste in this div tag, I'm going to paste the word section 1. That way I can talk to this section. I'm not talking to any other section. I'm just talking to this one section. If I wanted to talk to two sections at once, I could make sure that both of them have the same class. But for this, I'm just going to go in and I'm going to say section 1. Now I could do this with ID. Instead of class, I could say, I can use a hashtag, which would basically be the ID, but class is fine. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and then let's preview this. So you can see as I'm previewing it, the animation takes a little bit longer, that bounce animation. So it takes a little while to even start, and then the actual bounce takes a little bit as well. I've essentially affected the duration of this animation, and I can go in and I could create a duration for section 2 and apply the class of section 2 to that div tag, and then section 3 and section 4 as well. One more thing I want to cover is if you come into the index.html file, you may be wondering, well, why don't I just say I want to affect the duration of bounce? Why do I have to create a completely new class? The reason why is because you may be using bounce in several different locations. So you don't want to just use bounce because you want to be able to use bounce over and over, and you just want to talk to that one section. You don't want to talk to every section that has bounce. You just want to talk to that one section. And that's the reason why I gave this section a different name. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. So now that we've learned about durations, let's go ahead and talk about delays and what we can do with delays.